Hi there. Imagine that one day you find yourself at the very heart of the most boring night in human history. You are not just a spectator, you are a captive. Before you, in a marble hall, two titans of thought are arguing, Plato and Aristotle. Their words hang in the air like thick smoke, and every sound is a brick in the foundation of the world you live in. But before you get comfortable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'd really love to see who's joining us. Now get comfortable. We're starting. You walk into the grand hall, your footsteps echoing among marble columns that seem to defy time itself. It is the kind of place where the dust has its own lineage, where every breath feels filtered through centuries of heavy thought and discarded ideas. The air is thick, oppressively so, and as you move deeper inside, you realize that this is no ordinary gathering. Every stone beneath your sandals seems to sigh with exhaustion, as if it has heard one too many philosophical debates and would prefer a quiet retirement. You are not entirely sure how you arrived here. There is a vague memory of someone mentioning a great debate, a meeting of minds so profound that history itself might bend in its wake. Now, as you stand awkwardly between the shadows of columns and the stares of attendees, you feel oddly implicated in the invention of boredom. The faces that surround you are weary, their eyes marked by the peculiar shine of those who have endured long, meandering arguments. You catch a glance from an old man who looks as if he has not smiled since the last solstice. At the center of the hall, raised slightly above the assembled crowd, stand two men. They are unmistakable. One has the distant, almost translucent gaze of someone who dreams in abstracts. The other, younger but sharper, seems to weigh every particle of dust in the air, searching for order in the chaos of human existence. They are, of course, Plato and Aristotle, though the titles do little to capture the full drama that crackles between them. You sense anticipation in the room. It is not excitement. It is the same anticipation you might find in a city before the first thunderstorm of the year, a kind of collective holding of breath mixed with dread. These philosophers, you realize, are not just going to argue, they are going to build worlds, dismantle them, and leave you with the lingering suspicion that reality is not nearly as interesting as their theories. Plato surveys the room, his gaze passing right through you as if you were a necessary prop, a chair or a vase, present only so that he might speak to someone. You feel a peculiar kinship with the other listeners, all of whom have the haunted look of people who fear missing out on the birth of eternity. The historian in you notes this moment. Here is a congregation where boredom is not a sign of failure, but a sacred right. In this place, to be bored is to be initiated. Outside, the late afternoon sun struggles to filter through small, high-set windows, casting odd patterns on the floor that resemble chains, or perhaps the bars of some celestial cage. You wonder whether you have entered a prison built from ideas. A subtle, almost sweet scent lingers in the air, laurel perhaps, or merely the accumulated anxiety of ages past. Every cough, every shifting sandal, every whispered exchange contributes to a chorus that feels both intimate and endless. There is a sense that time here moves differently, that the present is merely a thin shell around something much older and far more patient. You realize, with a shiver, that you are not here to participate, not even to understand. You are here to witness. What you are about to hear will change the world, though it is entirely possible that the world will not notice for several hundred years. As Plato finally steps forward, adjusting his robe with the solemnity of a man about to perform surgery on reality itself, you brace yourself. You are here to listen. This is your role, perhaps the only role you will ever play in the machinery of history. If you are lucky, you will be remembered as the one who did not fall asleep. A single thought repeats itself, as soft and insistent as the beating of your own heart. The smell of eternity is, unmistakably, the smell of a room where two philosophers are about to begin. Plato does not so much begin to speak as he begins to unfold a labyrinth. His words are calm, almost hypnotic, drifting through the air like perfumed smoke. Every syllable seems to curl back upon itself, making you wonder if language has ever been more dangerous than in this moment. He stands straight, chin raised just enough to suggest a man who is accustomed to looking over the heads of mortals toward the horizon of eternity. He introduces his subject as if it were an old friend, the realm of ideas. You have heard of this before, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in a particularly long and dull lecture at some future university. To Plato, the world of tangible things is a mere echo, a faint and blurry reflection of something far grander. Reality, he says, is but the shadow cast by the true and eternal forms. What you see and touch is only the faintest whisper of what truly exists. There is a hush in the room. Perhaps some are captivated, but you sense a growing confusion among the listeners. An older man in the back begins to frown, as if Plato has just told him his favorite dish is, in fact, a shadow. For Plato, this is the point. Everything you have ever loved, bread, wine, laughter, even pain, is only real insofar as it participates in its perfect, immutable idea. The bread you eat is not bread, but a bread-like thing, a mere shadow of the perfect bread that exists somewhere beyond the reach of hunger and taste. You wonder how anyone can take such a theory seriously, and yet there is something beguiling about Plato's conviction. His voice has the certainty of a man who has never doubted himself, or at least has never admitted it. He paints the world of forms as an endless, silent kingdom where beauty, goodness, and truth sit upon thrones, indifferent to the petty squabbles of mortals. You realize, uncomfortably, that in this vision, even boredom itself might have a perfect form, a sort of ideal boredom, beyond reach, forever untouchable. As Plato speaks, his words grow denser. He describes the famous allegory of the cave, the most tragic story ever told about spectators and shadows. You picture men chained in darkness, staring at a blank wall, their entire lives a puppet show staged by forces they will never see. One man escapes and, stumbling into the blinding light of reality, returns only to be met with scorn and disbelief. It is, you admit, an excellent metaphor for listening to a philosopher. You begin in darkness, and any attempt to seek enlightenment merely makes your head hurt. The crowd is restless, but Plato does not notice, or perhaps he does, and chooses to ignore it. He continues, explaining how the wise must turn away from the world of senses and fix their minds upon the invisible, perfect forms. This, he assures you, is the only true path to wisdom. For a moment, you envy the prisoners in the cave. At least their chains are visible. You notice, with a kind of bleak amusement, that many listeners are nodding, not in agreement, but in that slow, drowsy way that signals the approach of sleep. Some scribble furiously on wax tablets, though you suspect they are drawing sketches of lunch or counting the cracks in the ceiling. Plato is undeterred. He reminds the assembly that his own teacher, Socrates, was condemned for corrupting the youth with these very ideas. You are unsure if this is a warning or an advertisement. A curious fact emerges as you observe the crowd. Some of Plato's disciples, you realize, never fully understood his teachings. They repeat the words, they learn the arguments, but the meaning slips through their fingers like so much water. Perhaps this is part of the charm or the danger of philosophy, that you can be seduced by the shape of an argument without ever grasping its substance. You begin to sense the true genius of Plato, his ability to create not only ideas, but disciples who worship his ideas without ever quite catching them. It is as if he is building a temple of shadows, a house where every room is a reflection of a reflection, and the only way out is to believe so deeply in the shadows that you mistake them for light. By the time Plato pauses, the room feels heavier, as if gravity itself has increased. You look around and see 100 faces caught between confusion, awe, and resignation. For Plato, this is the highest praise. He has transported his listeners to a place where nothing is solid, nothing certain, and the only thing you can rely on is that the world you thought you knew is just the shadow of a deeper, stranger truth. You sigh. The boredom here is not ordinary. It is ancient, ceremonial, and, you suspect, highly contagious. You are witnessing the birth of an idea that will echo through the centuries, an idea so powerful it can make you doubt the evidence of your own eyes. Plato smiles. He knows he has succeeded. The shadows have become real. You do not need to be a genius to notice when a man is on the verge of interruption. As Plato's voice continues to roll and echo, smoothing over every stone in the great hall with the weight of his perfect forms, you see Aristotle's fingers twitch against the edge of his robe. His face carries the particular tension of someone who has heard enough about otherworldly realities and is now prepared, perhaps compelled, to drag the conversation back to the world everyone else must inhabit. He does not shout. Instead, Aristotle leans forward, and when he speaks, it is with the confident, measured calm of a man who believes that truth if it exists, is somewhere in the dirt beneath your feet. Plato, my teacher, he begins, and for a moment it sounds respectful, even affectionate. Then, with the sharpness of a craftsman examining a crack in a masterpiece, he adds, but must we always chase phantoms when there is so much to learn from the things themselves? You sense a ripple of relief in the audience, as if the weight of the shadows has been briefly lifted. Aristotle does not deal in mysteries or perfect worlds locked away from human experience. His eyes are sharp, dark, alive. Where Plato seems to float above the crowd, Aristotle's presence is almost physical, practical, solid, inescapable. He tells you and everyone in the hall that things exist not because they resemble some eternal prototype, but simply because they are. A chair is a chair not by virtue of its invisible chairness, but because it is useful, constructed, real, and, most important, present. The crowd perks up. Even those whose thoughts have wandered to dinner and home seem willing to lend Aristotle a moment's attention. There is something oddly comforting in being told that what you see and touch is, in fact, real. Here comes an interesting fact. When Aristotle spoke, even the most bored and sleep deprived of his listeners could find their minds reawakened by a reference to fish, or birds, or the weather. He had a knack for grounding the conversation in things you might encounter on your walk to the market. He seems, at times, less like a philosopher and more like a very thorough neighbor with strong opinions about the local olive crop. You watch as he begins to dissect Plato's arguments. With careful patience, he teases apart the language, refusing to let any sentence rest on the fragile support of the unseen. Where Plato built palaces in the sky, Aristotle insists on foundations. He explains his famous doctrine that substance and form exist together, inseparable. The form is not locked away in a heavenly vault, but is right here, shaping every rock, tree, and loaf of bread. There is no need for a hidden world behind the world. There is only this world, and it is more than enough for a lifetime's thought. In that moment, you realize why some students, centuries from now, will call him the philosopher. He does not demand that you transcend your own senses or ignore your experience in favor of a more perfect vision. Instead, he invites you to open your eyes wider, to notice the details, to consider the causes and purposes of things. Bread is not just bread, but a product of grain, earth, water, fire, human labor, and, inevitably, hunger. It is not an idea, it is a history and a future all in one. Plato tries to respond, but the dynamic has shifted. Now Aristotle leads the dance. He introduces the concept of categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, passion. He lists them almost like the items on a tedious shopping list, and you see the scribes struggling to keep up. But beneath the monotony is a profound change. For the first time, reality itself is being systematically sorted, labeled, and understood. You, for your part, feel oddly reassured. Maybe it is Aristotle's calmness, Or maybe it is simply the pleasure of listening to a man who has no patience for shadows. Either way, you find yourself leaning forward, as do many others. There is a sensation of gravity here, a pull toward the earth, away from the vague and the unknowable. Another curious fact: in centuries to come, Aristotle's method will form the backbone of almost every science, from physics to biology to logic. He will become the standard by which clarity, order, and practicality but are measured. His system will be copied, modified, misquoted, and misunderstood, but never entirely lost. Yet, for all this earthiness, there is still something almost tragic in Aristotle's determination to make sense of it all. You notice how his eyes flicker when he describes the complexity of living things, the tangled web of causes and effects. There is awe, yes, but also the faint shadow of exhaustion, a recognition that the world, once you stop looking for ghosts, is both richer and harder to explain than any perfect form. As Aristotle finally pauses, you sense that the audience has, at last, returned to itself. The spell of abstraction is broken, if only for a moment. The listeners begin to breathe more freely. A few even smile. The argument has shifted from sky to earth, and with it comes the recognition that, while the heavens may be the domain of gods and dreams, the soil is where you must plant your feet. You glance back at Plato, who looks almost serene, as if he expected this interruption all along. You wonder if the point of philosophy is not to answer questions, but simply to keep the debate alive, forever suspended between sky and earth. Here, you think, is the beginning of a very old argument, and you, lucky or doomed, are here to witness its birth. You have heard of legendary atmospheres, the electric tension before a storm, the jubilant chaos of a festival, the hushed awe in a cathedral at midnight. But none of these can compare to the heavy, suffocating blanket that settles over this hall as the debate between Plato and Aristotle grinds forward. If excitement is the quickening of the heart, what you feel now is its exact opposite: the deliberate, grinding deceleration of existence, a feeling so profound and enveloping that you begin to suspect boredom itself is an ancient Greek invention, a priceless artifact passed down through generations. The air vibrates not with anticipation, but with obligation. Attendance at this philosophical dispute is a right, not a pleasure. The audience is bound by something older and stickier than enthusiasm. You see it in the posture of the elders, their chins resting on their hands, eyes fixed in the middle distance, pretending to contemplate deep matters while quietly surrendering to torpor. There is a quiet but unbreakable etiquette here, a culture of endurance. To fall asleep in the presence of great thinkers would be a disgrace, but to feign interest is almost a sign of respect. Even the room seems designed to enhance the experience of boredom. High ceilings amplify every cough, every shuffle, every stifled yawn, as if to remind everyone that time is passing very, very slowly. Marble columns divide the space into small, acoustically treacherous pockets, each a personal echo chamber for intrusive thoughts. The distant, filtered sunlight does little to brighten the mood, casting more shadow than light, as if the world outside is a rumor best left uninvestigated. You realize that here, in this grand hall, boredom is not a private inconvenience, but a public spectacle, almost a shared cultural treasure. It binds the listeners together more effectively than any philosophy, a subtle communion of sighs and blank stares. You start to wonder if philosophy is less about ideas and more about the ritual of enduring their presentation. You begin to respect the audience as much as the speakers. Their patience is almost heroic, their stillness a kind of stoic protest against the violence of novelty. A young student near you is making notes with a stylus and a tablet, his face a mask of seriousness. Peeking over his shoulder, you discover that he is not recording the debate at all, but rather composing an elaborate list of things he would rather be doing: climbing mountains, chasing goats, learning to swim, even cleaning the family cistern. You admire his honesty. Meanwhile, an older man nearby simply stares at the wall, his eyes unfocused, as if searching for the secret door that will let him escape into another, more eventful century. It occurs to you that this culture of boredom is itself a kind of philosophical stance. By suffering through these endless arguments, the audience demonstrates a rare commitment to treat even the dullest moments with gravity, to act as if every utterance might contain the seed of revolution. You suspect that for some, the act of sitting in this hall is a point of pride, a badge of honor in the ongoing war against restlessness. If boredom is inevitable, let it at least be collective, sanctified by history and the presence of greatness. There are subtle hierarchies in the ways people express their boredom. The highest class are those who can look utterly entranced while thinking about anything but the debate. Next come the restless, shifting in their seats, tapping their feet, glancing longingly at the exits. Finally, there are the honest, the ones who doze, drool, or mutter to themselves, rebels against the tyranny of philosophical discourse. From your vantage point, you can see a few daring souls try to sneak out during particularly tedious exchanges. Their stealth is impressive, their guilt non existent. Nobody stops them. The unspoken rule is that if you can escape unnoticed, you have earned your freedom. You wonder what stories they will tell later. I was there when Plato and Aristotle argued, but I left just before history was made. And yet, beneath the layers of weariness and routine, something deeper stirs. The words of Plato and Aristotle are seeds scattered in reluctant soil, and some of those seeds, you sense, may take root long after the audience has departed. The boredom is a kind of compost, enriching the ground for future thought. This is how great ideas survive, not by dazzling or delighting, but by persisting year after year through the stubborn indifference of those who listen. You are struck by an unexpected realization. The greatest philosophical systems are not born from fevered inspiration or sudden flashes of insight. They are the slow, incremental work of generations, built on a foundation of patience, endurance, and yes, boredom. The audience in this hall, silent, resigned, unmoved, are the true architects of the future. Without them, the ideas drifting through the air would vanish like smoke. You adjust your seat, breathe deeply, and resolve to endure. After all, you tell yourself, this is not just history, it is a test, a communal exercise in the ancient art of listening. And when the debate is over, when the echoes have faded and the hall has emptied, those who remain awake will be able to say, I was there, I survived, I listened, and because I listened, the world will never be the same. By now, you have become a connoisseur of the slow burn of philosophical boredom. But as Plato and Aristotle pause, exchanging glances like chess players, anticipating their next move, your attention drifts beyond the present moment, out into the strange world that Plato has built, not only in argument, but in stone and tradition. For it is not just in this hall that his ideas find expression. There is a place, you realize, where his theories are treated not as passing amusements, but as daily sustenance, as inescapable as hunger, the academy. The academy is no ordinary school. It is an institution born out of restlessness and dissatisfaction, built in a sacred grove, and dedicated to the pursuit of an invisible and mostly inaccessible truth. Its curriculum is as ambitious as it is opaque. Here, in the dappled shade of olive trees, men devote their lives to questions so abstract that they become physical burdens, weighing down the body as surely as stones in a pouch. You find it oddly appropriate that the school's founder insists on a life of modesty and discipline. Food at the academy is notoriously plain. The menu an unending litany of bread, olives, and the occasional reluctant cheese. You imagine the students sitting cross-legged, chewing slowly, their minds already wandering toward the next unsolvable puzzle, barely tasting the meal in front of them. Hunger is both literal and metaphorical, and in the academy, both are considered virtues. Sleep is another matter. It is discouraged not by decree, but by the sheer density of the questions posed. How can one rest when there are so many things not understood, so many forms left unexplored? The students learn to nap standing up, to snatch minutes of unconsciousness in between lectures, to treat fatigue as a badge of honor. They become pale, dreamy eyed, half present, caught between the world of forms and the world of exhausted bodies. An interesting fact drifts into your mind. Plato's Academy, this grand experiment in collective puzzlement, will outlive its founder by centuries. For nearly 900 years, students will file through its gates, sit in the shade of its trees, and attempt, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, to untangle the mysteries left by Plato and his successors. Empires will rise and fall, plagues and wars will rage, and yet the Academy will persist, a monument to the power of shared confusion. What do they study, these eager souls? Everything and nothing. Mathematics, ethics, astronomy, logic, rhetoric, each subject bleeding into the next, each question raising 10 more. There are no fixed answers, only new ways to doubt. Plato himself is rumored to have posted a sign at the entrance, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." It is not clear whether this is an invitation or a warning. The academy is open to all, but few survive its intellectual rigors. The daily life of the academy is a study in contradictions. Poverty and luxury mingle freely. The only true wealth is argument. The only true comfort, the cold embrace of unanswerable questions. It is not a place for the faint hearted or the impatient. In these groves, time slows, thickens, becomes almost unmanageable. A single conversation can last for days or even weeks, meandering from the nature of justice to the possibility of reincarnation to the proper method of cooking lentils. Friendships are formed and unformed at the speed of debate. There are no allies, only temporary companions on the long road to uncertainty. Rivalries simmer beneath the surface, flaring up over the smallest points of logic or the pronunciation of obscure terms. To survive in the academy is to accept that you will always be slightly hungry, slightly tired, and never entirely satisfied with any answer. You recall another curious fact. Plato's teachings are often misunderstood, even, perhaps especially, by his own students. Some become obsessed with the letter of his words, missing the spirit entirely. Others invent wild interpretations, turning subtle distinctions into ironclad dogmas. In time, the academy will fracture into warring schools, each claiming to possess the true meaning of Plato's thought. The irony is not lost on you. Even in his own sanctuary, the master cannot control the destinies of his ideas. Still, there is a kind of magic in the persistence of the academy. Through famine, war, plague, and the indifference of countless generations, the institution endures. Long after the buildings crumble and the olive trees are cut down for firewood, the echoes of its debates will linger, drifting through the libraries and lecture halls of future ages. The diet of ideas is not nourishing in any conventional sense, but it is strangely addictive. Once tasted, it cannot be forgotten. As you return your attention to the hall, you notice the students and listeners with renewed respect. They are heirs to a tradition of patient hunger, willing to suffer for the chance to brush up against the eternal, even if only for a moment. The academy is not just a school, it is a state of mind, a slow communal drift toward an ever receding horizon. The debate resumes, but now you see it differently. This is not merely an argument between two men. It is the visible tip of an ancient, invisible iceberg, a monument to the idea that meaning, if it exists at all, can only be found in the endless, communal endurance of boredom. As the debate grinds forward, you begin to notice a pattern. The room itself seems to tilt back and forth, as if caught in a slow philosophical earthquake. First, Plato draws everyone upward toward the dizzying heights of abstraction and the luminous boredom of perfection. Then Aristotle drags the conversation downward, rooting it in the tangled mess of reality and the pedestrian order of things. Each time they speak, it is as if the audience is being yanked by invisible strings, their collective attention ricocheting from sky to soil and back again. Plato's voice, once more taking center stage, is a gentle, insistent wind, soft enough to lull, relentless enough to wear down even the most stubborn resistance. He speaks of the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. There is always another, better version, a more just city, a truer beauty, a more perfect circle. You begin to suspect that boredom is not simply a byproduct of Plato's method, but its hidden purpose. Perfection, after all, is a kind of eternal stasis. Once achieved, nothing remains but to contemplate forever. Aristotle, by contrast, is the voice of the crowded agora, the muddled marketplace, the world of broken jars and arguing merchants. He is the champion of order, not the static, crystalline order of Plato's forms, but the restless, provisional order that emerges when people are forced to live together without murdering one another. For Aristotle, everything has its place, its cause, its reason for being. The universe, in his eyes, is not a shadowy prison, but a well organized workshop, eternally busy and just a little chaotic. The audience, sensing the growing tension, sits up a little straighter. Some are secretly rooting for boredom. After all, the promise of a perfect world is seductive, especially to those who are tired of the imperfections of their own lives. Others, perhaps those with blisters from the long walk to the hall, favor order, anything that promises to make sense of the noise and confusion of daily life is welcome, even if it is delivered in Aristotle's methodical monotone. You realize, with a sort of dry amusement, that what you are witnessing is not just an argument between two philosophers, but the birth of two opposing worldviews. Plato's boredom is a luxury, a palace of quiet contemplation reserved for those who can afford to ignore the messiness of reality. Aristotle's order, on the other hand, is a necessity, the hard won prize of those who must survive in a world that refuses to cooperate with anyone's ideal. A curious fact: this argument, tedious and repetitive as it might seem, will outlast every empire built by men. The tension between boredom and order, between the longing for perfect stillness and the need for functional organization, will seep into every future debate about politics, art, ethics, and science. Even the dust motes floating in the sunbeams seem to know that they are part of something endless, something that will echo through lecture halls and libraries for thousands of years. The debate grows more heated. Plato, refusing to be dragged down, returns to his vision of the philosopher king, a ruler who lives only for the contemplation of the good, who governs not for power, but for truth. The idea is as lovely as it is impractical, an entire city run on the principle of boredom as civic virtue. One cannot help but wonder if the citizens of this city would last a week before rioting out of sheer restlessness. Aristotle, never one to be outdone, counters with his own vision of a well ordered state. Here, laws are shaped by observation, not theory. Justice is the slow, patient product of compromise, not the sudden imposition of an ideal. Order, for Aristotle, is less about the suppression of chaos than about learning to live with it, to coax something stable and useful out of the ceaseless flux of human desire. The city, in his view, is not a temple, but a garden, messy, organic, always on the verge of being overrun by weeds. The sun begins to dip outside, the light growing softer, the shadows longer. In the hall, the mood becomes almost reverent, as if the participants sense that something of great importance is happening, even if it is happening at the speed of continental drift. You notice a young boy at the back, chewing a piece of bread so slowly it seems he is attempting to achieve platonic perfection in the act of eating. You see an old woman, eyes half closed, perhaps dreaming of a world in which all debates end before sunset. Here is another fact: this argument will not end tonight, nor tomorrow, nor in the lifetimes of anyone present. It will be passed down, battered and reinterpreted by monks and kings, scientists and revolutionaries, each convinced that they have found the answer to the riddle of human existence. Some will side with boredom, seeking salvation in the eternal, others with order, scraping meaning from the scraps of daily life. By now, you understand that philosophy is not the pursuit of truth so much as the art of surviving its absence. The world will never be perfect, nor entirely orderly, but as long as there are people willing to argue, there will be a reason to stay awake, if only to say you were present when boredom and order, sky and earth, clashed for the thousandth time. As the evening deepens, the debate shows no sign of ending. The audience, battered but unbowed, settles in for another round. In this room, at least, boredom and order are not enemies, but uneasy companions, bound together by tradition, stubbornness, and the faint, persistent hope that meaning, if it exists at all, can be coaxed out of the endless repetition of very old arguments. You adjust your seat, resigned to the fact that you are now part of a story that will be retold whenever someone, somewhere, needs to be reminded that philosophy is, above all, the long, patient art of not leaving the room. The air in the hall grows colder as Plato, undeterred by the mounting fatigue, prepares to unveil his grandest vision yet. You sense the subtle shift, the way listeners lean back in their seats or tilt their heads with the resignation of those about to receive a lesson both eternal and interminable. If boredom is the secret glue holding together the proceedings, then politics is the dust that settles in every untouched corner, an unavoidable topic, sure to provoke sighs, grumbles, and the occasional defiant nap. Plato begins not with the chaotic shouts of the marketplace or the gritty compromises of the city, but with a kind of sacred geometry. His state is not built on the whims of the people or the ambitions of the powerful, but on the assumption that justice and order can be achieved if only everyone remembers their proper place. There is, he insists, a natural hierarchy: the wise at the top, the strong in the middle, and the rest, well, somewhere near the bottom, preferably quiet and obedient. He describes his ideal society with the precision of a mathematician drawing a triangle. Rulers, he claims, must be philosophers, those who have gazed into the realm of pure ideas and returned to organize the world according to its invisible, unchanging laws. These philosopher kings, chosen not for their popularity or wealth, but for their love of truth, will govern with a kind of benevolent indifference, uninterested in gold, glory, or the small pleasures of daily life. You look around and see a mixture of expressions: admiration, skepticism, outright confusion. For some, Plato's vision is intoxicating: a city run by the wise, immune to the usual vices of greed and ignorance, where every citizen is placed where they belong and the train of history finally runs on time. For others, the prospect of government by a council of dreamers sounds less like utopia and more like a very polite prison. Here is an interesting fact, and it stings with irony. Plato's Republic, the original handbook for his ideal state, will become a bestseller of sorts among those who have never governed anything more complex than their own kitchen. Generations of would be reformers will copy his schemes, undaunted by the fact that none of them seem to work for very long outside the world of theory. The dream of a perfectly ordered society, you realize, is an evergreen. It will sprout in every age, watered by equal parts hope and desperation, each time doomed to wither under the sun of actual human nature. Plato continues, describing the educational system of his state. Children raised in common, shielded from corrupting influences, taught to revere the good above all else. Love and marriage, too, are regulated, not by passion, but by mathematics and state decree. Art is censored. Anything that does not point the soul upward is forbidden. Even music, which you might have hoped could slip past the censors, is permitted only if it fosters courage and self discipline. You imagine the daily life of Plato's citizens, rising early to a carefully planned routine, meals measured and dull, conversations restricted to approved topics. Laughter, if it is allowed at all, is brief and purposeful. There is something comforting in the predictability, like the ticking of a well made clock. But beneath the surface, you sense a rising discomfort. How long could anyone endure such perfection before longing for a little disorder, a little chaos, a bit of badly tuned music? As Plato's speech stretches on, you catch the glazed look of the audience, their eyes fixed somewhere just above his head, perhaps picturing themselves as philosopher kings, perhaps remembering a particularly good loaf of bread, forbidden by the state's dietary code. A few scribes try to keep up, but their styluses drag ever more slowly across the wax, their minds caught between duty and daydreams. Plato is relentless. He speaks of harmony, unity, the beauty of a state where everyone knows their role and no one ever questions the arrangement. You reflect, not without irony, that the first book ever written about politics was, in a sense, also the first book about boredom. Plato's city is beautiful, rational, and utterly exhausting. Its citizens are free from want, but also from surprise. Everything meaningful has been decided in advance, and nothing is left to chance except, perhaps, the possibility that someone somewhere might wake up and realize that perfection is indistinguishable from stagnation. Outside, the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the columns, and the hall grows dim. You are aware, in a way that feels both personal and historical, that you have just witnessed the moment when boredom became a political virtue. To govern is to enforce order, and to enforce order is to manufacture the kind of ennui that can only be described as civic. The applause is polite, brief, and utterly without conviction. Even Plato, you think, senses the chill in the air, a silence not of reverence, but of quiet, collective endurance. You wonder if, somewhere in his ideal state, there is a place for rebellion, or at least a tavern. Yet for all its flaws, the vision lingers. Boredom, Plato teaches, is the price of stability. And as you shift in your seat, trying to find a position less hostile to your lower back, you realize that, for better or worse, the world will keep returning to this argument, forever searching for a system that promises peace, even if it means putting everyone, including yourself, gently but firmly to sleep. The applause that follows Plato's ideal state is polite, cautious, and, most notably, brief. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the collective longing for something more human, something less measured by the clockwork of eternity. This is the moment Aristotle claims for his own. Unlike Plato, Aristotle never floats above the crowd. He is solidly, even stubbornly, present, always prepared to remind his listeners that a state is made of people, not perfect patterns. He begins not with abstractions, but with anecdotes, a brawl in the market, a family squabble, a quarrel over water rights. The audience stirs. These are things they understand, not the dizzying architecture of philosopher kings and prescribed marriages, but the lurching compromises of everyday life. In Aristotle's world, politics is not a monument, but a garden, overgrown, unpredictable, sometimes pleasing, often disappointing, but unmistakably alive. He tells you that the city is an organism, not a diagram. Each citizen, he argues, is not merely a functionary, a cog in the machine of state, but a living being, brimming with wants, hopes, appetites, and grievances. Laws must bend and flex to accommodate the twists and turns of human nature. Justice, Aristotle insists, is not a fixed thing. It is a practice, an ongoing negotiation, a careful balancing of competing goods. You sense a surge of interest from the crowd. Even the bored scribes perk up, their wax tablets catching flashes of inspiration as Aristotle maps out a world in motion. He does not promise perfection. In fact, he is suspicious of it. The best laws, he says, are not those that enforce an abstract good, but those that work in practice, even if only for a time. The happiest state is not the one with the fewest disputes, but the one where disputes can be settled, where citizens argue and then, somehow, go back to being neighbors. He calls this the golden mean, the art of living somewhere between excess and deficiency, between tyranny and anarchy, between Plato's frozen city and the chaos of the mob. Here's an interesting fact. Aristotle's political theories would much later find a fan in Alexander the Great. But at this moment, his audience is less imperial and more pragmatic. They want to know how to stop their neighbors from stealing their goats, not how to attain eternal unity. Aristotle obliges, his explanations full of practical advice, cautious optimism, and the sort of detail that only a man who actually talks to farmers can provide. You notice, not for the first time, the subtle power of Aristotle's method. While Plato's listeners daydream about a city that never was, Aristotle's followers nod in recognition. They have seen this world, lived in it, tripped over its uneven stones. You realize that for all his skepticism about ideals, Aristotle is offering something just as radical, a politics rooted in the needs of the living, not the fantasies of the dead. Aristotle has his own hierarchy, but it is less rigid than Plato's. He speaks of citizens and rulers, of rich and poor, of the delicate machinery that keeps the state in motion. Everyone, he says, must contribute according to their capacity and receive according to their needs, a phrase that, centuries from now, will be borrowed, mangled, and used to justify revolutions. But for now, the idea feels fresh, almost dangerous. You can see the younger listeners whispering to each other, their eyes bright with the possibility that politics might be something other than a mechanism for producing boredom. And Wamasiet. For all his talk of compromise, Aristotle does not shy away from discipline. A state, he warns, is always at risk of coming apart. The task of politics is not to eliminate conflict, but to contain it, to turn it into something productive. Order is not an accident, it is a perpetual achievement, something to be won anew each day. As he speaks, you sense the faintest stirrings of rebellion, an audience no longer content to endure, but eager to act. Perhaps the greatest difference between Plato and Aristotle is not what they believe, but how they make others feel. Plato inspires resignation, a calm acceptance of your allotted role. Aristotle provokes restlessness, the desire to test, to challenge, to improve. And yet the boredom is never far away. Even as Aristotle waxes practical, you spot a cluster of listeners stifling yawns, their patience worn thin by the endless weighing of virtues and vices. You recall, with a private smile, that even the most grounded advice can feel like a burden when stretched over the hours. But in this, perhaps, lies the true genius of Aristotle's politics: to transform boredom from a static force into a restless energy, something that pushes citizens not to submit, but to persist, to build, to repair what inevitably falls apart. Another curious fact: Aristotle's approach will shape the thinking of generations who crave not utopia, but survival, a politics for the living and the not quite awake. As Aristotle concludes, there is a sense of possibility, however faint, in the fading light. Here, you realize, is the promise of politics, not the end of trouble, but the art of living with it, day after day, one compromise at a time. You stand, stretch, and for a moment, the hall feels almost bearable, a place where people, in all their boredom and confusion, might just be able to muddle through. The air in the hall is now so dense with argument and fatigue that you begin to suspect it could be bottled and sold as a cure for insomnia. Yet there is a shift, a different current that flows through the words as Aristotle, growing more animated, introduces a new topic, one that will define not only the future of philosophy, but the very structure of boredom itself, the invention of logic. Aristotle does not simply speak of logic as an abstract curiosity. He wields it like a craftsman, unveiling a new set of tools, confident that, with these in hand, the world can finally be understood, or at least systematically catalogued. No longer will men wander in the mists of unreason, he promises. With logic, every question can be broken into its parts, every confusion dissected, every error named and tamed. You watch as he carefully lays out his system, syllogisms, premises, conclusions. The audience, once slumping with weariness, now sits up, if only slightly, in a posture of wary attention. There is something oddly soothing about Aristotle's relentless tidying up of reality. He draws lines, names categories, and insists that even the wildest arguments must pass through the gate of reason. No more wild speculation, no more labyrinths of metaphor and allegory. Now everything must make sense, or at least submit to the ritual of seeming to make sense. Here's an interesting fact. From this moment, logic will become both the salvation and the curse of every would be philosopher. Its rules are simple, almost insultingly so, but their consequences are endless. The law of non contradiction. Something cannot be both true and not true at the same time, will be repeated for thousands of years by people desperate for certainty and by others who find delight in contradiction. The syllogism, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal, will haunt every classroom, lecture hall, and late night argument across continents and centuries. You notice that, as Aristotle speaks, some of his listeners begin to draw geometric patterns on their tablets, using the discipline of logic as a new canvas for their boredom. They are not mocking him. On the contrary, they are acknowledging a grim truth. Logic is not here to entertain, but to structure, to restrain, to bring order to the chaos of thought. In its purest form, logic is a celebration of necessity. No surprises, no mystery, only what must follow, one careful step after another. You glance at Plato, who listens with a mixture of pride and resignation. After all, Aristotle was his student, and every revolution is a betrayal as well as a tribute. Plato's own dialogues are riddles, dances, riddles within riddles. But here, with Aristotle's method, the riddles must give way to rules. The audience senses the magnitude of this change, even if they are unable to articulate it. You sense a division, invisible but irrevocable, those who will spend their lives building arguments, and those who will spend their lives escaping them. Here is another fact, quietly tragic. With the invention of logic, boredom is elevated to an art form. No longer is it the accidental result of too much talk or too little food. Now it is enshrined as the very structure of knowledge. To study logic is to submit to tedium, to embrace repetition, to memorize forms and patterns until they blur into one another, indistinguishable and eternal. The reward is clarity, or at least the illusion of it, a feeling that, for once, your mind has found a floor, even if the ceiling remains out of reach. But Aristotle is not finished. He insists that logic is only the beginning. With it, men can classify the animals, measure the stars, debate the nature of the soul and the structure of the state. He offers examples, some inspired, others laughably mundane. If all olive trees grow in groves, and this is an olive tree, then yes, yes, you get it. You look around and see that the audience gets it too. They are grateful in a way that only the perpetually confused can be for the small comfort of certainty. Yet beneath the comfort, a restlessness stirs. You begin to realize that logic, for all its promise, can only ever explain so much. There are questions that it cannot touch, desires it cannot satisfy, silences it cannot break. Even Aristotle, for all his genius, seems to know this. He ends his lesson not with a triumph, but with a warning. Logic is the tool, not the answer. It will keep you busy, but it will not set you free. Centuries from now, scholars will look back on this moment and marvel at its paradox, that the invention of logic, the very science of clarity, could also create a new and deeper boredom. For now, you simply sigh and stretch your limbs, grateful for a break from metaphysics, even as you suspect that logic, like boredom itself, is a companion you will never quite escape. As the discussion winds down, the audience slips once more into a familiar silence, not the silence of awe, but the silence of those who know they are present at the birth of something both magnificent and exhausting. Logic has arrived, and with it, a new era of very organized tedium. No philosophical spectacle is complete without an argument about the soul. As the daylight in the hall thins to a pale, hesitant gold, and listeners shift in their seats, some in search of comfort, others merely to wake themselves, Plato and Aristotle find themselves circling this most elusive of topics. The soul, they both agree, is important. They agree so fervently that you immediately begin to suspect the conversation will never end. Plato, ever the lover of unseen worlds, opens the discussion with the gentle assurance of someone who has visited eternity and found it to his taste. The soul, he says, is immortal. It existed before you were born and will continue long after you are dust. It is the true self, imprisoned for a time in a body that is little more than a distraction, something you put up with until reason finally sets you free. Death, he hints, is less a tragedy than a homecoming. You watch the faces in the hall. Some go pale, others brighten. The prospect of immortality is, you realize, only comforting if you believe your soul is worth preserving. Plato's description is elaborate, even theatrical. He divides the soul into three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Reason should rule, but rarely does. Spirit gives us courage and pride. Appetite, of course, is the troublemaker, responsible for hunger, lust, and all the mundane annoyances of being alive. A just soul, like a just city, is one in which each part knows its place. This, you suspect, is another way of saying that boredom is the ultimate virtue when the appetites are tamed and reason reigns. there is little left to do but think endlessly about thinking. But Aristotle, predictably, is not content with flights of metaphysical fancy. He listens politely, then clears his throat and brings the soul down to earth with all the finesse of a mason resetting a crooked stone. The soul, he says, is not some ghostly visitor in a rented body. It is the form of a living thing, its shape, its pattern, its animating principle. Without the soul, a body is not just asleep or unwell, but simply not alive. Soul and body are inseparable, he insists. They come together, and when they part, there is nothing left to talk about. For Aristotle, the soul is a set of functions: nutrition, perception, movement, thought. Plants have souls, he says, one for taking in nourishment and growing. Animals have souls that can feel and move. Only humans possess the highest form, the rational soul, capable of reflection and reason. But don't be flattered, Aristotle seems to say. This rational soul is fragile, prone to error, and often overwhelmed by the baser needs it cannot control. As the debate continues, you feel the heaviness descend once more, as if the entire hall is being slowly submerged in philosophical molasses. Even the scribes, usually so diligent, seem to falter. Their styluses pause mid sentence, caught between two eternities: Plato's soaring, disembodied soul and Aristotle's practical, earthbound spirit. A few listeners stare out the windows, eyes glazed, lost somewhere between the promise of immortality and the certainty of dinner. Yet, for all the repetition, you recognize something strange and new in the air, a kind of philosophical vertigo. If Plato is right, you are haunted by the pressure of eternity, your soul's fate always hanging in the balance, every choice echoing forever. If Aristotle is right, you are comforted and confined by the certainty that nothing lasts. Each life is a brief flicker, and the soul's story ends when the body's does. The audience, you sense, is divided not only in opinion, but in temperament. Some crave the drama of endless life, others long for the simplicity of oblivion. Here's an interesting fact, and not a cheerful one. The debate about the soul, started on this long afternoon, will become one of the most persistent engines of philosophical boredom in human history. Centuries will pass, and still men and women will gather to discuss whether the soul is immortal, whether it is simple or composite, whether it survives death or dissolves with the body. Thousands of pages will be written, hundreds of schools will rise and fall, and still the question will remain as unsettled as ever. You glance at your fellow listeners. Some are slumped in what can only be described as metaphysical exhaustion. Others stare at the ceiling, perhaps imagining what their own souls might be doing if freed from the tyranny of this endless debate. It strikes you that this is the most dangerous kind of boredom, not the ordinary, manageable kind, but the existential sort that leaves you uncertain whether you are alive or only pretending. At last, Plato and Aristotle fall silent, not because they have finished, but because they have run out of ways to say the same things differently. The audience exhales as one, a deep, ragged sigh, half relief, half regret. The question of the soul, you realize, is not meant to be answered. It is meant to be endured, carried like a burden from one generation to the next, each time slightly heavier than before. As dusk settles, you wonder if this is not the true lesson of the philosophers. Eternity is not just the fate of the soul, but the fate of the debate about the soul. It will go on always, forever, until every possible answer has been given and forgotten, and the only thing left is the silence of a room grown dark with thought. There is a peculiar silence in the hall, more telling than the clamor of any argument. It is the silence of absence, a silence so persistent and so taken for granted that it becomes invisible. As Plato and Aristotle turn the subject from the soul to other weighty matters, you begin to notice, not for the first time, but with a deeper, more pointed clarity, that the room is filled almost exclusively with men. They are old men and young men, serious men and bored men, men with the tired dignity of the perpetually lectured. If a woman is present, she is invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of this grand, masculine boredom. You scan the crowd again, searching for any hint of feminine perspective. There is none. No voices rise in interruption. No laughter disrupts the grave proceedings. The few women allowed into this philosophical world exist only as illustrations, metaphors, or afterthoughts. Plato, when pressed, mentions women in his ideal city. Yes, they may be guardians. Yes, they may receive education, but always as a footnote, an exception, a philosophical experiment rather than a lived reality. It is an interesting fact, an amusingly grim one. The presence of women in philosophy is almost entirely theoretical. The greatest arguments of the ancient world are conducted in their absence, their wisdom and weariness left undocumented. It is a presence without presence, a silence that echoes even louder than the voices that fill the hall. The philosophers debate the nature of justice, the soul, the state, and yet the basic facts of daily life, childbirth, hunger, the rhythms of care, are passed over in silence, as if to mention them would break the spell of abstraction. You wonder, not for the first time, what the debate might sound like if women had been present in more than metaphor. Would the arguments have changed? Would Plato have written dialogues featuring real women? Or would Aristotle have bothered to classify the daily labor that keeps the world running? Instead, the feminine is invoked only as a symbol, the soul as a bride, wisdom as a veiled woman, truth as something to be courted and won. The actual lives of women, full of noise, conflict, resilience, are politely ignored. There is a certain comfort in the predictability of exclusion. The men in the hall, many of them born into privilege and leisure, do not notice what is missing. Their boredom is luxurious, a boredom that can afford to ignore half the world. You imagine, for a moment, a parallel gathering somewhere in the city, a kitchen filled with the clatter of pots, a courtyard buzzing with children, a garden where women share knowledge of herbs and weather and wounds that do not heal. Here, too, there is philosophy, but it goes unrecorded, deemed unworthy of marble halls and careful notation. Centuries from now, a woman will finally be recognized as a philosopher. Her name, Hypatia, will appear as a curious anomaly in the annals of history, a rare flower in a garden otherwise tilled by men. Her presence, too, will be marked by violence, her memory both revered and mourned. Later still, more women will find their way into the conversation, but always against resistance, their ideas scrutinized as exceptions to some unwritten rule. You realize, with a heaviness that matches the gloom of the gathering dusk, that the absence of women is not just a historical fact, but a structural flaw. The great debates about justice and the soul are incomplete, skewed, hollow at the core. To listen to philosophy in this hall is to listen to a chorus that is always missing half its voices. The silence is not a pause, but a barrier. And yet, the absence is not total. It lingers as a question, an ache, a ghost in the machinery of thought. Sometimes, a philosopher will stumble on a truth so obvious, so rooted in daily life, that you suspect it must have been borrowed, indirectly, unconsciously, from the lives of women they never mention. Even the metaphors betray the presence of that absence, wisdom, patience, the mother of all virtues. You try to imagine the philosophers confronted by this lack. Would they listen, or would they invent new arguments to justify it? Would Plato admit that his city is incomplete, or Aristotle that his categories are missing an essential element? Most likely, you suspect, they would shrug, adjust their togas, and return to the business of being bored by each other. As the evening deepens and the shadows lengthen, you understand that the silence of women is not just a problem of the past. It persists in every retelling, every classroom, every summary of great ideas that forgets to mention who was allowed to have them. This, too, is part of the history you are witnessing, a history written in absence, structured by what goes unsaid, as much as by what is argued and recorded. A few listeners notice the change in your expression, as if sensing the shape of an argument that will not be given voice for centuries yet. But the debate continues, untouched and uninterrupted, just as it always has. The presence of women everywhere and nowhere is written in the very boredom that fills the hall, a reminder that even in the world of ideas, some absences are so profound they become invisible. By now, you have learned that boredom is more than a mood. It is an atmosphere, a climate, a season that drags on, clouding every thought. As the philosophers circle endlessly around justice, virtue, and the soul, you find yourself drifting, neither fully awake nor truly asleep, trapped in the strange borderland that only philosophy can summon. Here, sleeplessness is not just common, but expected. If you are not already suffering from insomnia, you will be soon. It is a curious feature of philosophical gatherings, you realize, that sleep becomes a precious commodity, exchanged in furtive, guilty snatches. Eyes droop, heads nod. Sometimes a listener is startled awake by his own snore, blinking in panic, convinced he has missed the decisive argument. He has not. Even Plato, whose thoughts soar above the ceiling, cannot lift his audience out of the heavy dusk that settles over their eyelids. Aristotle's practical wisdom fares no better. Each insight is met with a collective yawn, each careful distinction followed by an even longer pause as the brain rebels and demands rest. But sleep, it turns out, is a philosophical problem in itself. The mind, made restless by too much abstraction, refuses to settle. You recall an ancient fact, told in a whisper. Some of the greatest ideas were born not in moments of bright clarity, but in the endless hours of sleeplessness. When the city sleeps, the philosopher lies awake, tracing arguments through the darkness, rehearsing counterexamples, finding, against all hope, that the most interesting thoughts are also the most exhausting. You see this pattern everywhere. Socrates, so it is said, would sometimes stand motionless in thought from dawn to dusk, so lost in his private debates that even the gods would lose interest. Later philosophers, deprived of coffee, would pace the porticos under the indifferent stars, counting the hours until morning and muttering to themselves about the unresolvable puzzles of being. Sleep is a luxury, but also a threat. To rest is to risk forgetting, to lose the fragile thread of an idea that might never return. The audience, for its part, does not take this insomnia lightly. You see men clutching at their robes, rubbing their faces, praying for a merciful end to the session. Some invent little rituals, chewing on reeds, pinching their own arms, whispering lines of poetry to stave off the encroaching fog. One particularly desperate listener has taken to scrawling rude caricatures of the speakers in the margins of his notes, a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of endless analysis. And yet, you cannot help but notice a strange transformation. The longer you are deprived of sleep, the more surreal the proceedings become. The marble columns blur, the words of Plato and Aristotle drift into and out of sense, and you begin to wonder if you are dreaming after all. Reality thins, grows slippery, as if the hall is afloat on a sea of uncertainty. In this half waking state, philosophy reveals itself as a kind of lucid dream. Everything makes sense, and nothing does, all at once. Here is a fact rarely mentioned in the annals of history. Insomnia is a hidden engine of philosophy. Tired minds are creative minds. Fatigue opens strange doors. It is no accident that so many philosophical traditions, from the sleepless meditation of Eastern sages to the midnight ramblings of Western skeptics, have treated sleep as both obstacle and inspiration. The boundary between wakefulness and dreaming is, after all, just another version of the boundary between appearance and reality, body and soul. There is a certain grandeur in this exhaustion, a perverse pride in being awake when the rest of the world has surrendered. Some listeners, you suspect, secretly cherish the suffering, as if every missed hour of sleep is proof of their dedication. They compare bags under their eyes, like warriors showing scars, and greet the sunrise with the grim satisfaction of survivors. In their sleeplessness, they become a brotherhood, bound not by shared understanding, but by shared fatigue. Of course, there are those who simply give up. You see them slumped in corners, wrapped in their cloaks, letting the drone of debate lull them into shallow, guilty naps. Nobody blames them. Even the most rigorous intellect can be defeated by a truly relentless philosopher. Outside, the night deepens. The air grows heavy, almost soporific, and yet the debate refuses to end. Plato, undaunted, launches into another exploration of the good. Aristotle counters with the stubborn persistence of a man who knows he is right, but also knows nobody is listening anymore. The audience drifts, some awake, some dreaming, some lost in the strange haunted valley between. It is at this point, somewhere between the third and fourth hour of continuous argument, that you understand the true secret of philosophy. It is not the clarity of ideas or the certainty of conclusions, but the endurance of those who keep listening. Long after wisdom and sleep have both fled, philosophy is what happens when you cannot sleep and cannot quite give up on understanding. As dawn threatens at the edge of the sky, you realize, with a mixture of dread and dark amusement, that the debate will never end. There will always be another question, another sleepless night, another listener caught between boredom and hope. In this way, philosophy is not only an answer to insomnia, but its most faithful companion. You would think, after hours spent circling the soul and the state, that the philosophers might allow their weary listeners some reprieve. Instead, as the first rays of morning stretch across the stone floor, Plato and Aristotle turn to that most inexhaustible of subjects, ethics. For the crowd, it is the intellectual equivalent of being handed a second shovel when you are already buried to your neck. If sleep is a luxury, certainty is an impossibility. Plato, as ever, seeks absolutes. Goodness, he insists, is not a matter of circumstance or convenience, but an eternal form, a perfection that hovers forever beyond the reach of corrupt mortals. There is, he declares, a single standard for virtue, a north star by which all actions can be judged. To live rightly is to align one's soul with this eternal good, regardless of pain, hunger, boredom, or any of the thousand ordinary miseries that make up a human life. His voice, although tired, rises with conviction. Goodness, for Plato, is like a mathematical truth, unchanging, eternal, immune to the complaints of those who would prefer an easier answer. A just man suffers less than an unjust soul, even if he loses everything, Plato says, as if reading a theorem rather than describing the fate of actual people. His certainty is dazzling and exhausting. You see listeners nodding, not because they agree, but because disagreement seems too tiring to attempt. Aristotle is less interested in absolutes and more concerned with what actually happens. For him, ethics is not about ascending to the realm of forms, but about finding the narrow, winding path through the mess of daily choices. Virtue, he says, is a habit, not a revelation. It is built from countless small decisions, most of them made while hungry, bored, or annoyed. The good life, Aristotle argues, is the life of reason practiced in community, aiming for the mean between excess and deficiency. It is, you reflect, a peculiarly unsatisfying answer. Aristotle offers no final guarantees, only the promise that, with enough practice, one might occasionally do the right thing, or at least avoid the worst mistakes. His famous golden mean sounds suspiciously like moderation dressed up in a toga. When pressed for an example, Aristotle famously uses courage, the mean between cowardice and recklessness, but a moving target, never exactly in reach. The audience shifts restlessly. Some crave Plato's clarity, the comfort of a rule that admits no exception. Others find themselves drawn to Aristotle's ambiguity, the realism of a system that admits how easy it is to get things wrong. In this division, you see the outlines of every future argument about right and wrong. Here, you realize, is the secret poison of ethics. It can justify anything as long as you phrase it carefully enough. An interesting fact emerges in this stifling atmosphere. Ethics, for all its claims to universality, has always been the tool of doubters. Every system breeds dissent, every rule an exception. The more the philosophers speak, the more you sense the anxiety beneath their words, a fear that, just perhaps, there is no final answer at all, only an endless process of making do. A few listeners have already checked out, their minds wandering to the mundane calculus of the day ahead: what to eat, whom to trust, how to avoid the next session of debate. But a handful remain, caught by the spell of doubt. These are the ones who will carry the conversation forward across centuries and cultures, always hoping for an answer that never quite arrives. Ethics, you realize, is less about right conduct than about right questioning. It is the art of hesitation, the discipline of considering one more possibility, one more consequence, one more exception to every rule. It is not the certainty that makes philosophers dangerous, but their relentless doubt, the way they keep asking, keep worrying, keep finding flaws where others see solutions. Here's a fact to remember, though it may keep you up at night. Most of those who quote Plato and Aristotle will never read their works to the end. Their names become shorthand for arguments few will finish. Yet the questions they raise, what should I do? Who should I become? Are questions no one can escape. You watch as the debate winds down, the two philosophers now circling one another in a tired, respectful dance. There are no winners. Nobody leaves with the assurance that virtue is simple or that the good is easy to find. Instead, the hall is left with something more valuable and more troubling: the sense that, in ethics, the only honest position is doubt, and the only truly virtuous act is to keep searching. As the light fills the room and the audience rises, stiff and uncertain, you realize that this is the real legacy of philosophical debate. Not certainty, but the uneasy conviction that everything important is still up for question. To live ethically in the world of Plato and Aristotle is not to be sure, but to remain stubbornly awake. By now, the hall is a place where time folds in on itself. The debate has wound its way through the heights of ideal forms and the trenches of practical virtue, and now, inevitably, It lurches toward the grandest question of all, the search for truth. You suspect, with a shiver that is equal parts dread and anticipation, that the philosophers are about to drag the audience through the slowest, longest journey in history, a road paved with doubt, marked by detours, and leading, perhaps, to nowhere at all. Plato is the first to speak, and he approaches the idea of truth with all the ceremony of a high priest performing a rite. To him, truth is not a thing to be uncovered, but a light to be remembered. He invokes the metaphor of the cave, now so familiar to you that it seems less a story than a recurring nightmare. In this tale, the journey toward truth is a painful ascent from darkness into the blinding, pitiless glare of reality. The few who survive this journey, those rare souls who see the forms directly, return to the cave changed, misunderstood, and frequently ridiculed. Plato's faith in absolute truth is unwavering, but his path is lonely, perhaps even tragic. The crowd senses this, and the more honest among them begin to fidget. They know, as you do, that such clarity is seldom found outside the philosopher's imagination. Yet there is an allure to it, a promise that behind the confusion of appearances, something solid and eternal waits to be discovered if only you are patient and willing to be bored out of your mind. Aristotle, ever the pragmatist, sees the search for truth differently. To him, truth is not an all or nothing revelation, but a slow accumulation of observations, inferences, and corrections. Nature does nothing in vain, he intones, and you can feel the audience relax. Here, at least, is a truth they can test. Aristotle speaks of induction and deduction, of gathering evidence and revising one's beliefs. For him, the pursuit of truth is less a pilgrimage and more a long, careful walk through an overgrown field, notebook in hand. Yet, you cannot help but notice the weariness behind his optimism. If Plato's journey is a sprint toward an unreachable summit, Aristotle's is an endless series of small steps, each one eroded by time and error. The audience shifts uncomfortably. Some dream of final answers, others grow pale at the thought of perpetual uncertainty. The philosophers, for their part, seem locked in an ancient struggle, the hope for certainty versus the habit of correction, the longing for arrival versus the discipline of always setting out again. Here's an interesting fact, half comic and half tragic. Ancient Athenians were famous for loving debate, but few believed it could deliver truth. Nobody finds the answer, an old man mutters nearby, and you suspect he is both right and wrong. The search for truth is a public ritual, a performance as much as a quest, and its value lies less in discovery than in endurance. The greatest compliment in this culture is not, he was right, but he kept asking. The philosophers, perhaps sensing their own futility, begin to repeat themselves. Arguments circle back on old ground. Plato invokes recollection. Aristotle counters with observation. At some point, a listener asks for a clear definition of truth. Plato offers a riddle. Aristotle offers a list. The answer, if there is one, is quickly lost in the shuffle. You see, in the dull glint of their eyes, that even the greatest thinkers are sometimes bored by their own questions. Outside, the day grows long, light creeps slowly across the marble, and a fresh wave of drowsiness settles over the crowd. The pursuit of truth, for all its grandeur, is exhausting. It is a test not of intelligence, but of stamina. You begin to suspect that the only real lesson here is that truth, if it exists, is always out of reach, an asymptote you approach without ever arriving. There is, however, a grim sort of comfort in this. If truth cannot be found, at least you will never run out of things to look for. The philosophers, undeterred, keep talking. The audience, in various stages of wakefulness, keeps listening. The search for truth becomes less an event than a condition, a chronic state passed down through generations, like myopia or the family silver. A final fact whispered among the tired listeners. Ancient Athenians believed the gods valued the effort more than the result. To search is to honor them. To stop searching is to invite misfortune. Perhaps you think this is why the debate persists. It is not the answer that matters, but the willingness to keep asking, even when everyone involved suspects the road leads nowhere. As the philosophers circle back to their familiar starting points, the debate ends not with revelation, but with resignation. The search for truth is endless, and in this endlessness, you glimpse the true genius of philosophy. It makes a virtue of persistence, a religion of repetition, and above all, a legacy of boredom. If you could measure time by size, the hall would be ancient by now. The philosophical marathon has worn thin the patience of even the most zealous listeners. Each new argument feels less like an epiphany and more like the gentle erosion of stone by centuries of wind. Around you, the collective energy of the audience has settled into a heavy, unspoken understanding. This is no longer a gathering of individuals, but a congregation united by boredom. You scan the room and see its effects everywhere. Some listeners slump against the marble columns, their togas bunched up beneath them like makeshift pillows. Others rest their chins in their hands, eyes fixed on some imaginary point far beyond the speakers, perhaps a memory of a happier, more exciting afternoon. A few make no attempt at pretense, their heads drooping forward in the rhythmic dance of impending sleep, jerking upright only when their own snoring betrays them. It is, you realize, a uniquely communal fatigue, the kind that settles not on one person, but on the whole room, as if boredom itself were a miasma, something thick and visible, drifting from speaker to listener in slow, suffocating waves. Even the scribes, those champions of endurance, have lost their edge. Their writing has grown lazy and looping, their wax tablets filled with doodles, grocery lists, and, in one memorable case, an epic poem about leaving the hall and never returning. Here's a fact to treasure. Ancient Athenian assemblies sometimes lasted for 8 hours or more. Laws were debated, decrees shouted, grievances aired, and through it all, the citizenry remained, often more out of duty than passion. The patience required is legendary. To be present was to be honorable, to endure was to be virtuous. Those who could not bear it snuck away, inventing urgent business elsewhere or feigning sudden illness. Escape was a minor art form, mastered by the desperate and admired by all. But in the great debate of Plato and Aristotle, even escape loses its glamour. The doors of the hall loom like forbidden fruit, the passage to freedom guarded by the social expectation that one must stay, if only to say, I was there. So the crowd remains, bound together by a strange, wordless contract. You endure, I endure, and together we make history, even if all we make in truth is an indelible impression in the marble floor. You notice how boredom changes people. The ambitious ones, who began the day taking copious notes and nodding vigorously, have slowed to a crawl, their notes now cryptic abbreviations and arrows pointing nowhere. The skeptics, once quick with whispered critiques, now whisper only complaints about the temperature or the hardness of the seats. The true believers cling to every word, but their devotion has the ragged, exhausted edge of faith tested by adversity. There are, of course, the inevitable rebels. One young man at the edge of the assembly carves crude jokes into the wood of his writing tablet. Another, older and wiser, composes satirical verses about philosopher kings and the golden mean, reciting them in a mutter to anyone within earshot. It is not true insurrection. Boredom has sapped the will for anything as energetic as rebellion, but it is enough to keep spirits from collapsing entirely. And yet, even in this weariness, something peculiar happens. The boredom, oppressive and universal, becomes a kind of shared identity. Strangers exchange knowing glances, sighs become a private language, and for a fleeting moment there is camaraderie in the struggle. It is not the exhilarating unity of battle, nor the joyful harmony of a festival, but a solidarity built on endurance, a stoic pride in simply staying awake. You begin to wonder if this too is part of the lesson. Philosophical progress is slow, often invisible, and the only guarantee is that most of it will be forgotten. But the discipline of sitting, of listening, of bearing with the uncertainty leaves its mark. When the debate ends, the audience will leave not with answers, but with the subtle satisfaction of having endured something important, if only the trial of time itself. As the sun slants lower and the air thickens with drowsiness, a last faint applause stirs among the listeners. It is not for a brilliant argument or a dazzling insight, but for themselves, a small, weary acknowledgement that survival, in the end, is its own kind of triumph. You sit a little straighter, sharing in the grim fellowship of the moment. In this hall, on this long afternoon, boredom has become a collective experience, a story you will carry with you, one sigh, one stifled yawn, one weary, unbroken silence at a time. By now, time has stopped pretending to pass. The sun outside is nothing more than a faded memory, and the flicker of torchlight on marble is the only hint that the world beyond the hall still exists. Inside, the conversation, if it can still be called that, has settled into the slow, relentless rhythm of something older and far more patient than human beings, the immortal machinery of ideas. You realize that what you are witnessing is no longer simply a debate between Plato and Aristotle, nor even a matter of statecraft or ethics. It is a duel with time itself. Both philosophers, in their own way, are waging war against the oblivion that threatens all things human: bodies, empires, languages, even memory. Each argument, each carefully chosen word, is a stone laid in the unending wall of history. Every repetition, every echo, is an act of resistance against being forgotten. Plato speaks first, and for once his tone is less that of a dreamer than of a general plotting his campaign against mortality. His theory of forms, he claims, is the only way to defeat time. The eternal world of perfect ideas does not age, does not rot, and does not care if anyone is bored by it. In this invisible kingdom, everything worth knowing is preserved, unchanged, untouched by decay. To participate in philosophy is, for Plato, to participate in immortality itself. The audience, or what remains of it, barely stirs. You sense a peculiar mixture of awe and exhaustion, the way one might feel listening to a funeral sermon for someone who, inconveniently, refuses to stay dead. Plato's vision is not comforting. Immortality, it turns out, is a heavy burden. To think forever, to exist forever, is to risk being trapped in an endless recurrence of questions, answers, and doubts. There is no escape from the eternal. There is only the hope that somewhere in the unchanging, one might finally be understood. Aristotle, meanwhile, fights on a different front. His immortality is not that of unchanging perfection, but of perpetual renewal. For him, ideas survive not by being preserved, but by being tested, challenged, and adapted. Truths that last are those that endure the battering of time and circumstance, the constant reshuffling of priorities and opinions. His categories, his logic, his careful studies of the natural world, all are built to outlast their creators, not by remaining the same, but by being endlessly reborn. Here's a sobering fact: the works of Plato and Aristotle will outlive the walls of Athens, the laws of emperors, the very language in which they spoke. For centuries, scholars will copy and debate their texts, translating, mistranslating, adapting, arguing. Their ideas will slip silently into the crevices of other cultures, shaping religions, sciences, governments, and arguments between bored university students who have never seen a marble column. These ideas will survive plagues, wars, and forgetfulness, not because they are flawless, but because they are, paradoxically, endlessly flawed. They invite reinterpretation and so remain alive. You glance around the hall, seeing faces that could just as well belong to another era. For a moment, you imagine the centuries spinning past, the collapse of Rome, the rise of distant empires, libraries burning, monks copying faded manuscripts by candlelight. Each time the ideas are threatened with extinction, someone, somewhere, rescues them, not out of reverence, but out of a nagging suspicion that even the most tedious argument deserves a chance at immortality. The philosophers continue, but now their words are heavy with the awareness of their own fragility. Plato insists that true wisdom is timeless. Aristotle counters that only the useful survives. Neither admits defeat, for to do so would be to acknowledge the only real enemy, the certainty that for all their brilliance, they are as perishable as everyone else in the hall. You begin to feel your own insignificance, not as a wound, but as a comfort. To listen is to join the chain of witnesses, each link forged in the fires of boredom and endurance. It no longer matters if you understand every point. What matters is that you are here now, lending your attention to something that will endure long after you are dust. There is an irony at the heart of it all. The audience's exhaustion is itself a guarantee of the immortality of ideas. Every stifled yawn, every barely repressed sigh is a vote for the persistence of thought. Philosophy survives because people are willing to be bored for its sake, generation after generation, century after century. Outside, the night is absolute. Inside, the arguments grow softer, less urgent. The philosophers are speaking less for victory and more for survival, whispering to each other across the gulf of time, knowing that somewhere, somehow, someone will be listening. And you, at last, understand the final lesson of the hall. The point is not to finish the debate, but to continue it. The only real immortality is that of the question endlessly asked, endlessly endured. Somewhere between the midnight arguments and the slow crawl of dawn, you begin to question your own presence in this never ending assembly. Why are you still here? Why does anyone stay when every word seems destined to circle back on itself, when every new idea is a restatement of the old in slightly different terms? The practice of listening, you realize, is itself a form of philosophical discipline, a ritual as sacred and as tedious as any religious fast. You catch yourself drifting. The marble patterns on the floor begin to seem as significant as anything uttered by Plato or Aristotle. There is a hum in the room, not of excitement, but of low grade perseverance. You are not alone. The other listeners are caught in the same spell, bound together by the same stubborn refusal to leave before it is over, or at least before someone else dares to stand and shuffle out first. It is at this stage of the debate that you recognize the true paradox of philosophy. Nobody listens because they expect to be convinced, but because they are afraid of missing something important. There is always the faint hope that, just beyond the next analogy, the next rhetorical flourish, the next weary counterexample, lies the one idea that will change everything. Most will not find it. Most will forget what was said as soon as they step into the sun. But nobody is willing to admit this in the moment. To listen is to gamble with time. You recall, with a touch of irony, that the majority of people who quote Plato or Aristotle will never finish a single work by either. Fragments, summaries, and misremembered arguments will form the true currency of their legacy. The practice of boredom is passed down as carefully as the texts themselves, each generation rehearsing the motions, pretending to care, until the moment comes when, by some twist of fatigue or fate, someone actually does. There is a curious fact hidden in this endurance. The history of philosophy is written as much by its listeners as by its speakers. Every idea that survives does so because someone, somewhere, decided it was worth repeating, even if only out of duty or spite. The philosophers on stage are only half the story. The rest is made up of those who copied, translated, disputed, and yes, yawned their way through the centuries. The chain of boredom is unbroken. You wonder, in your darker moments, whether this is enough. Can a tradition built on repetition, on the grim satisfaction of having been there, truly shape the future? Is there any virtue in enduring what is, frankly, almost unendurable? And yet, for every hour spent in passive absorption, there are flashes, moments when the mind, numbed by the monotony, suddenly sharpens and a single phrase or paradox takes root. This, perhaps, is the real function of boredom in philosophy. It is not a failing, but a medium. In the endless gray, the smallest spark is a revelation. Great ideas do not always arrive in a blaze of inspiration. More often, they slip in through the cracks, unnoticed, while you are fighting to stay awake. It is a humbling thought, and not a little depressing. The future of thought depends on the willingness of ordinary people to listen past their limits. The teachers know this. That is why, in every age, philosophers quote their predecessors, alluding to debates that nobody remembers in detail. The ritual of citation is an invocation, a way of reminding everyone that the only thing older than the argument is the act of listening itself. You realize now that your boredom is a kind of gift to the ages. By staying, by listening, you have become part of something larger than yourself, a human chain stretching back to the first questions and forward to the last. There is a dignity in this endurance, a stubborn refusal to let the conversation die. Through your discomfort, you carry the weight of traditions that will persist long after your own memory is lost. Perhaps this is the quiet heroism of the philosophical audience, not the brilliance of a single mind, but the collective willingness to sit through tedium, to find meaning in repetition, to believe, against all evidence, that it matters. Philosophy, you see, is not only the love of wisdom, but the love of not leaving the room. As dawn creeps back across the sky, you glance at the faces around you. Some are asleep, some are frowning in concentration, some are simply waiting for the end. Yet all are in their way, practicing the discipline of boredom. They are the guardians of the argument, the keepers of the flame, however dim and wavering it may be. You sigh, shift in your seat, and brace yourself for the next round. Listening, you finally understand, is not a passive act. It is a struggle, a discipline, a form of hope disguised as fatigue. In this long night of philosophy, you are both witness and participant, enduring so that the debate might continue, and so you listen on. By now, the air in the hall is thick with the ghosts of arguments, some fierce, some feeble, all of them circling back on themselves like the tales of ancient, sleepy snakes. The torches have burned down to stubs, casting long, flickering shadows that seem to grow more real than the philosophers themselves. As Plato and Aristotle reach the final rounds of their duel, you sense an invisible consensus settling over the crowd. No one expects a winner, and no one expects to leave unchanged. The ending is not dramatic. There is no raised voice, no triumphant closing statement, no great revelation that sends the listeners stumbling to their feet in epiphany. Instead, the debate simply loses momentum, like a stone thrown into a bottomless well. Plato summarizes his faith in the eternal. Aristotle reaffirms his trust in the world as it is, and the two men, having shaped the destinies of empires with their words, quietly step back into the ordinary silence from which they came. You look around and notice that, for the first time in hours, perhaps days, no one is scribbling notes, no one is whispering critiques. The audience sits in the kind of stillness that only true exhaustion can produce. You sense the relief of those who have survived, not just the argument, but the ordeal of expectation, the promise that philosophy, if pursued long enough, will produce something other than more questions. It is, of course, a delusion. The absence of victors is the final lesson. In philosophy, the only winner is the one who does not fall asleep first, a dubious honor considering the cost. The two great men have failed to convince each other, and in doing so, they have given the world a gift, an unfinished conversation, forever open to interruption, contradiction, and repetition. A curious fact: in most human endeavors, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end, often with applause, perhaps even a parade. In philosophy, there is only the cycle. Arguments begin, circle, fade, and return. Each generation is called to the arena with the same hope and the same resignation. No medals are awarded, no names are carved in marble, for finally solving the nature of justice or the shape of the soul. The audience rises one by one, some with groans, some with the slow reverence reserved for funerals and other long ceremonies. They file out of the hall, eyes blinking in the uncertain light, unsure whether they have witnessed a victory, a stalemate, or a particularly elaborate form of group punishment. There are no shouts of acclaim, no accusations of defeat, only the quiet shuffle of sandals on stone, the communal sense of a trial endured together. You linger, curious about the strange mixture of satisfaction and disappointment that fills the air. A few diehards linger as well, perhaps hoping for a secret postscript, an extra crumb of wisdom dropped in the afterglow. But the philosophers have already begun to withdraw into their separate orbits, surrounded by their most loyal followers, rehearsing old arguments in softer, more private tones. In this moment, you realize how different philosophy is from war or politics or love. There are no trophies, only traces, the lingering echo of a question, the unfinished business of a doubt. To have been present at the end is to know that endings are illusory, that every final word is merely a pause in a story that will begin again, somewhere else with other listeners. It is a sobering, quietly tragic fact that philosophy rewards only endurance. Those who stay awake the longest, who keep asking when others have left, are remembered not as victors, but as witnesses. And so, though you reflect it, the world changes not through answers, but through the sheer, stubborn continuity of the argument. As the last stragglers leave the hall, the shadows reclaim their territory. The dust settles, the torches gutter out, and you are left with a final, bleakly comforting thought. In philosophy, nobody ever truly wins, but nobody truly loses either. The victory belongs to the debate itself and to those who, against all odds, managed to keep their eyes open until the end. You step out into the night, tired, but somehow larger, carrying the weight of questions that will outlast even the memory of the men who first posed them. The argument is over for now, but you know, as surely as you know the sun will rise again, that it will begin anew. Somewhere, someday, another crowd will gather, another pair of voices will duel, and the absence of victors will once more become the engine of thought. The hall is empty now, save for the final echoes that seem reluctant to depart, like guests who have outstayed their welcome. Outside, Athens resumes its ordinary rhythm. Traders call out in the agora, children dart between sun bleached columns, and the world, with an indifference that borders on cruelty, continues much as it did before. Yet you, and all who endured the debate, cannot help but feel that something invisible has shifted, that the air itself is heavier with meaning, even if most cannot say what exactly has changed. At first glance, it appears that nothing has happened. No new law has been passed, no enemy defeated, no harvest secured by the night's ordeal. But quietly and inexorably, the aftershocks of this dispute between Plato and Aristotle will ripple outward, touching lives that have never seen the inside of a marble hall. The ideas born in boredom, hammered out through sleepless hours and collective endurance, will become the scaffolding for empires and religions, universities and revolutions. Here is an interesting fact, one both reassuring and terrifying. The most powerful ideas in history seldom announce themselves with fanfare. They seep in slowly, almost imperceptibly, woven into the language of lawgivers and poets, preachers and schoolchildren. Plato's vision of a world shaped by perfect ideals, of philosopher kings, and the tyranny of the good will haunt the dreams of reformers and tyrants alike. It will give birth to utopias, and more often to disappointments. Aristotle's stubborn attention to particulars, his belief in observation, reason, and the messy order of the real world will arm generations of scientists, jurists, and bureaucrats. The careful distinction between things as they are and things as we wish them to be will enable the slow march of knowledge, the codification of logic, the birth of every modern discipline, from physics to biology to political science. Every university, every library, every syllabus bears his fingerprints, whether or not the students ever notice. You realize, in a moment of melancholy amusement, that even the boredom of the debate has its legacy. The willingness to endure, to sit and listen, to rehearse the old arguments, and add only a single new wrinkle, this too becomes a habit passed down the generations. The patient discipline of philosophy, the sense that wisdom requires a lifetime of repetition, becomes the backbone of entire civilizations. Somewhere, centuries from now, another student will struggle to stay awake in another lecture, never knowing that their yawn is a tribute to the Athenian assembly. There is a dark side to these consequences as well. Ideas, once loosed into the world, cannot be controlled. Plato's longing for perfection will justify censorship, repression, the quiet suffocation of anything deemed disorderly or impure. Aristotle's faith in observation will sometimes slide into mere bureaucracy, an endless cataloging that forgets the purpose of knowledge altogether. Both visions, divorced from doubt, will enable as much folly as they prevent. And yet you see now, the real consequence of the debate is the creation of a new kind of memory, a living, contagious uncertainty. The arguments between Plato and Aristotle are never truly settled, but their persistence shapes how people dream, doubt, argue, and govern. To live in the shadow of this debate is to live with the knowledge that every certainty can be challenged, every ideal reimagined, every tradition overturned. You recall, almost in spite of yourself, that for centuries after this night, philosophers will be burned, exiled, imprisoned, or worse, made irrelevant by those in power. Yet the conversation will persist, always threatening to break out again whenever someone, somewhere, has the patience or arrogance to ask, what is justice? What is the good life? What is real? That is the real revolution, not in swords or banners, but in the steady pressure of questions that refuse to go away. It is a strangely humbling thought. You, who have done nothing but listen, have participated in a transformation as profound as any battle or invention. The city will sleep, the world will forget your face, but the questions will remain, changing hands like heirlooms, reworded but never resolved. The true legacy of the debate is not a single answer, but an appetite for more, more questions, more thinking, more honest boredom. So you walk home under the first pale hints of dawn, feeling heavier, older, changed. You know that you will struggle to explain what happened in the hall, that your words will fail to capture either the grandeur or the tedium, but the consequences are real. The world, for all its sameness, is forever altered, haunted by the memory of two men arguing in the dark, and by the faint but unbreakable hope that truth is somewhere still to be found. The hall stands silent now, a stone monument to both memory and exhaustion. The last echoes of argument have faded. The shadows stretch across empty benches. You gather your cloak, unsure whether the heaviness in your limbs is relief or something stranger, a reluctant gratitude for having survived. There is no applause, no celebratory feast, not even a whispered promise that the ideas you have witnessed will bear fruit. Instead, there is only you, walking out into the quiet morning, the city stirring back to life around you. You step into the cool air and pause, half expecting the world to look different. It does not. Athens is as dusty and chaotic as ever. The same donkey brays in the same alley, and the same market vendors shout the same prices, for the same tired olives. The faces you pass are mostly indifferent, their lives ruled by needs more immediate than the shape of the soul or the structure of the state. You wonder if they can sense, as you do, the faint, invisible residue of all that was debated. If the great quarrel of forms and substance leaves even a shadow on the walls of the baker's shop. For a moment, you try to recount what you have heard. You summon the themes: justice, the soul, the good life, the dizzying debate between order and boredom, the slow, grinding march of logic, the tragedy of absence, and the triumph of persistence. But your mind, weary as it is, rebels. Details blur, arguments slip away, and what remains is less a set of answers than a texture, a mood, an odd feeling of having witnessed something at once important and deeply, profoundly tedious. Yet there is a strange dignity in this tedium. The memory of it becomes a kind of possession, a heavy, awkward jewel you carry in your pocket. You realize that while most will never know or care who won the debate, for there were no winners, and while few will ever read a word of the dialogues that consumed your night, everyone will inherit the consequences. The city is unchanged, but the world is different, if only because someone stayed to listen. You recall the faces of the audience, the scribes with their tired hands, the students doodling in the margins, the elders slipping into sleep, the rebels scratching jokes into the wood. You remember the slow, collective sigh as the arguments circled and doubled back on themselves, the secret pride in enduring when escape seemed easier. You realize, with a small jolt of clarity, that you have become one of them, one of the silent custodians of memory, a nameless part of the long, unbroken chain of witnesses. It is perhaps the most ironic twist of all. The greatest changes in history so often arrive wrapped in boredom, disguised as routine. Nobody will write songs about this night. No festival will commemorate your yawns or your quiet determination not to leave before the end. Yet you suspect that, in the centuries to come, historians and poets alike will look back and find meaning here, reading greatness into what was, for you, simply a test of patience. Here is the final, most honest fact of all. The philosophical tradition is not built by geniuses alone, but by the patient, the bored, the quietly stubborn. Each time a question is asked and not answered, each time a listener sits through a debate that refuses to resolve, the legacy of philosophy grows. The memory of boredom, endured together, becomes the seed from which new arguments sprout, stranger, sharper, perhaps even more tedious than those that came before. As you walk home, the city waking around you, you realize that you are now marked. You carry within you a piece of that endless conversation, a fragment of Plato's dreams, a trace of Aristotle's order, a ghost of the questions that neither could quiet. The world feels at once heavier and lighter, as if weighed down by the inheritance of centuries, but also buoyed by the knowledge that nothing truly ends. You will tell this story, perhaps, but only to those patient enough to listen. You will remember the hall, not for the clarity of its truths, but for the weight of its silence and the shared achievement of having been bored together in the service of something larger than comfort or understanding. You will forget the arguments, but not the atmosphere. You will lose the details, but not the feeling that for one long night you were present at the birthplace of eternity. And so, you join the ranks of all those who have listened, endured, and left without answers. You become part of the eternal memory of eternal boredom, the slow, ceaseless river in which all philosophy flows, and from which, perhaps, the world itself is always quietly being remade.